everyone and welcome back to the channel. So at this point we're nearly 4 years into the current console generation of PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series S or X, whichever one you've got. And so if this generation lasts about the same time as the previous one, then we're actually about halfway through already. It's a bit weird to think about, but yeah, the PS4 and the Xbox One generation lasted for about 7 years in total. Now we've been getting lots of rumours about mid-generation refreshes, a PS5 Pro of some kind, and also a new lineup of Xbox Series consoles. We saw this before with the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X and S, and it's had me thinking for a little while now about whether or not we actually need these consoles, and actually should this generation last longer than the one before it. So that's what this video is about today. I wanted to talk about that a little bit more. Now it's been going this way for a little while, and it probably won't be news to anybody, but everything at the moment in the gaming industry is pointing towards there being a lower number of these sort of big mainline or AAA games, whatever you want to call them, over this generation compared to past generations. This obviously started in 2020 when lockdowns forced everyone to work from home. Game development took a bit of a hit, and for a while we all felt the effects. There were less games coming out over the following years, but there was this sense that it was temporary, everything would eventually go back to normal. But I no longer think that that's true. We've been hearing from developers recently more and more that games are taking longer to make. Gaming worlds are getting bigger and bigger. They're becoming a lot more detailed with these graphical improvements, character animations, huge variations in biomes and creatures. And of course, depending on the game, you also have ones which have a lot more depth to various different mechanics and combat. On top of this, we've also sadly spent the last 2 years with a whole bunch of layoffs and studio closures. It's been some of the worst in the industry, at least that I can remember, for a long time anyway. Now, obviously everybody's hoping that all of these developers will have found or will find other jobs. I know that a number of new studios have popped up, which is great. And in fact, I recently saw that 50 of the Tango Studios developers have been hired by a new publisher, actually the publisher of PUBG, to make Hi-Fi Rush 2. They've started a new studio. Now this is incredible, but of course they'll be starting from the beginning again, I would think, so it's probably going to take a while before we see anything. So all of this, games taking longer to make, them being bigger and more intensive, not to mention studios shutting down and reopening, all of this I think means that we're going to continue to see fewer games being released than in the previous generation. And if you compare something like the number of PS4 exclusives versus the number of PS5's exclusives, we're actually far off the halfway mark in terms of number of games, even though we're halfway through that generation's worth of time. This was just a feeling for me at first, so I did do a quick search on Google, and apparently there are around 58 PS4 exclusives that came out over its lifetime, and so far we're only at 16 PS5 exclusives. Now, some of these are, they're upcoming this year, and it is very rough numbers that I found on places like Wikipedia, and it doesn't include games that were, say, PS4, PS5 exclusives, but then came to Steam later. It's taken those out of there. But, even if the run numbers are rough, they're not bang on, I do think that they fit in with how this generation has felt. Now, of course, you also have to bear in mind that a good number of these games that have come out on PS5 so far are actually remakes. There's been quite a few of them. Some of these I think were more needed than others. For example, I didn't really see the point of remastering both parts of The Last of Us, parts 1 and 2 for PS5. But on the other hand, I did think that something like Demon's Souls or Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, their original games are from, much longer ago, PS1 and PS3. So it makes sense to bring those forward. I don't think I really need to talk about how first-party Xbox releases have been going, but essentially if we keep moving at this pace, then by the end of sort of a standard console generation, that's starting to be about 7 years, we will have way less releases than we did versus the previous generation. If you remember the Wii U, that was regarded as a failure. Well, actually looking back, it does have a decent library of exclusive games, but that is before most of them were ported over to Switch. It's just that they took a long time to come out, and that was sort of seen as part of the reason why that console failed. Not the whole reason, there was a lot of marketing. People didn't know whether it was a part of the Wii or a sequel to the Wii. There's a lot of other stuff, but the games that came out were definitely part of that. And I'm not saying that the PS5 and the Xbox Series are necessarily on par with that. Maybe the Xbox is. But in terms of game numbers, it feels like we could be in that ballpark for this generation. Now, with fewer games being released by Sony and Xbox, maybe that could be the reason that we're sort of getting these first hints of a mid-generation refresh. Or maybe it's something that's always been planned, I'm not too sure. I lean towards the side that it was always the plan to have this sort of mid-generation refresh and a new lineup of consoles coming out. But with how things have gone over the start of this period, the last 3.5 to 4 years, I don't really think there's a big appetite for it. I would like to hear hear what it is that you think on this though. I do understand the idea that with a batch of new refresh consoles we can finally hit 4K 60 FPS gaming, but I do sort of feel like that's something we should have had already. If you sort of follow, let's just talk about the PlayStation consoles, the PS4 ran games at 1080p 30fps, and when the PS4 Pro came out, that could run games at either 4K 30 or 1080p 60, so it was an upgrade. With the release of the PS5, it did seem like we were finally going to be getting a device that could run 4K and 60 FPS. Now, I'm not really sure whether or not Sony promised that, but I definitely remember the marketing saying that PS5 could play games at 4K up to 120 FPS. Now, this of course would come with some caveats. Nobody's going to expect that you can get 4K 120 FPS on all games all the time, but it does make it sound like 60 FPS would be much more standard. But really, we didn't get that. We still often have to choose between frame rate and resolution, and that's because games keep getting bigger and more detailed. So the promise of the rumored PS5 Pro would be 4K 60 FPS, and it just kind of feels like something we've been promised before. And given the number of games that we've had so far, I do think there's less of a reason for people to double dip on consoles this time around. Sure, you will always get a number of hardcore fans that will buy every single iteration, but for a lot of other people, if Sony is releasing only a couple of games a year that they're actually interested in buying, then upgrading those from, say, either 4K or 60 FPS to 4K and 60 FPS, you wouldn't get as much use out of a new console, and if that console is expensive, then maybe less people will be willing to buy it. So this kind of ties into my idea that maybe this generation of consoles should last longer. I don't really know how long. 10 years feels like a really long time, so maybe 8 or 9 would be a good way to go. If this was a normal generation, then in just a couple of years, studios would have to start looking ahead at, what new hardware was coming, a PlayStation 6 or an Xbox 720, whatever it's going to be. And so that could actually mean that there's only 1 or 2 new releases from each set of developers still to come on this generation. But if you extend it, then you're giving these teams more time to bring amazing games to this set of consoles instead of having to pivot fairly soon. I know a couple of years is not really that soon, but in terms of game development it is, especially with the points that I've talked about earlier, which mean that games take longer to make. So maybe you don't agree with those bits and you still think that, the console generation should be about the same and we should get refreshes already. I've got another couple of points and they both fall under the category of graphics. So first of all, the jump from PS3 and Xbox 360 onto PS4 and Xbox One, well, that felt like a bigger jump than from PS4 to PS5 or Xbox One to Xbox Series. Now, if we're halfway through this cycle already and they're already thinking about the next iteration of console, does that mean that we would see even less of a jump graphically to a new set of consoles? And if so, could that affect the sales of these new consoles if the games that came out on the shiny new console don't look too different? That sort of thinking was already around in the first few years of this generation. I saw a lot of stuff where people were saying the early games were held back by being cross-gen and they didn't look next-gen enough. And so I could see that happening again, but maybe even on a larger scale, if the jump, for example, from Xbox Series X to the Xbox Series 720 feels just a little bit too small. On the other hand, if we give that technology another few years to develop, then you might give more people a reason to upgrade and it would sort of boost your initial sales of both the consoles and whatever launch games came out with these new ones. On a similar line, we haven't really had any games yet, I don't think, that feel like they really push the potential of these current consoles. If we take Killzone, that was one of the first PS4 games to be released, and sure, that looks good, and especially when the PS4 first came out, it looks really good. But if you compare that to games coming out towards the end of that cycle, so games like The Last of Us Part 2, you can really see the difference, and you can see that the developers have sort of got a handle on what the system is capable of, and they're delivering the best looking games possible. Now, I'm not saying that the games we've had coming out over the last few years don't look good. Demon's Souls was a release date game and I think it looks absolutely gorgeous, but we've not really yet had a game on PS5 or Xbox Series X where the general consensus has been, something along the lines of, okay, yeah, this looks amazing, how did they make this machine do that? We've not had any games yet where the devs seem like absolute wizards pulling magic out of aging hardware, and so it feels like there must still be potential in the consoles that we have, so it would be a shame to move on so quickly without giving studios a chance to really get to grips with these systems. So this video has really been about PlayStation and Xbox specifically so far, but I do want to talk a little bit about Nintendo because I think this is one area where they have gotten it right with the Switch. They obviously don't follow the same time frame as the other consoles, they don't come out around the same time, they sort of come out in the middle of the others generation, but The Switch has been out for about 7.5 years, and while there have been hints here and there that we were going to get a new console soon, we've not had an announcement for it. So by the time that happens, we might be looking at maybe 8 years by the time a Switch successor comes out. Nintendo did not do a mid-generation refresh. There are people who theorize that they were going to do one, but maybe all the lockdowns affected production, and I do sort of believe that that is actually true. Now, the Switch is a console where I think there is a better argument that we would have had a Switch Pro, or whatever you want to call it, maybe not a Switch Pro. Handheld gaming technology has been advancing quickly since the Switch first came out, so if you look, for example, at Switch graphics versus Steam Deck graphics, I think that that means a Switch Pro would have been a good bump up in power, and I think it would have been popular. But for some reason or other, we didn't get one. Switch console sales at this point are starting to dip, it's true, but really I think that they have been so good for so long and continue to be good even now, purely because of just how many great games Nintendo has released on this console year after year. This is what I think Sony and Microsoft should be trying to emulate with their consoles. I don't think we need new hardware, that's not really what I think they need to do, and it's probably too late, but I would have said that it's better for them to take that money, put it into studios instead, and start filling the shelves with brand new amazing games for their consoles that players love. Games make a system, and that's what we've been lacking just a little bit so far with this current generation. And so that's really why I think we don't need to refresh. We don't need a new generation in 3 or 4 years. Just make more games that we want to buy, and then people will keep buying this lineup of consoles just like they've been doing with the Nintendo Switch nearly 8 years later. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it interesting. Let me know what you think about it down in the comments. Do you agree? Do you disagree? I do just want to talk for a second about the style of this video. It's a little bit different to what I normally do. I'm trying something new. I really like the videos that I make at the moment, you know, on things like Steam Deck, handheld consoles, the Switch, but some of them can take a long time to make, so I wanted to try a little bit of a discussion video like this and see how you like it. There's not really a lot happening on screen, and you can almost treat it like a podcast, but the fact that there is much less editing required, it just gives me a little bit more time to sort of mull over ideas for this video, but also other videos that I'm sort of coming up with at the moment. Normally, due to the time that my other videos take to make, I basically have to start the next one as soon as I finish one in order to stick to anything like a regular schedule. Each video doesn't necessarily get a lot of time for me to sort of mull it over, make changes if I want to. It sort of is kind of a case of I've recorded it and I don't want to make too many changes now, let's get it finished and get on to the next one. So if you do like these discussion videos, then I'm hoping it'll give me a little bit of thinking space that will help me improve all of my videos. If there are any topics that you'd enjoy hearing me sort of ramble on or discuss about, then let me know. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.